I'm Jenny Smith. I'm the chair of the Cloud Cafes on behalf of Stroud District Green Party, and work with a wonderful team of people behind the scenes to pull these together every month. We, I think, are maybe on our 14th Cloud Cafe since the beginning of 2020. And today's subject is the right to protest. So we've got 4 fantastic speakers lined up. We're going to be talking about the future of the right to protest and peaceful protest, and what that means for different groups, and some of their personal experiences on that subject. Obviously, the highly controversial police bill will be talked about today from those different perspectives as well, and we will get your thoughts and opinions on that as well. Please feel free to use the chat function at any point to ask a question to any of our speakers. They'll be posed, the majority of them, at the end of the session. If everyone wouldn't mind turning off their cameras, except for our speakers, just so that we can have them in a nice speaker view and be able to see them, and we'll get you guys to put your cameras on again later on. So thank you very much. So I'll do a short introduction for each of our speakers, and then we'll be able to crack on. So I think one of 2 or 3 returning speakers. We've got Laura Baldwin, who's here for her 2nd Cloud Cafe. She's from the Ocean Rebellion and is actually an Olympic sailor. She was one of the hundreds of campaigners who protested in the Cornwall at the G7 summit this year to try and convince politicians to take action and to, act on the commitments that they made for the climate in Paris in 2015. It's unfortunate that they thought it was appropriate to celebrate with airplanes and steak dinners and those kinds of things, but hopefully what Laura did with the group of people also have an impact, and we will hear more about that now. Thanks, Laura.
Okay, wasn't quite briefed that it was a G7 talk, but my talk is fitting nonetheless. Thank you very much for inviting me back to speak tonight. I'm the mother of an 8-year-old child, and it's his future that motivates me every day to try and do something, anything, to sound the alarm, to pressure governments, corporations, to educate people, to make the necessary physical changes within their homes, within their communities, and trying to educate and inspire others to do anything that they can to help with this crisis that we face. I'm a member this year of the Green Party Executive Campaigns Committee. I'm a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion. I'm a co-founder of Greens Can, together with Rupert Reed, Alison Teal and Sharat Ali. I'm a member of Ocean Rebellion as an activist, Champions for Earth. I was invited to be on the World Olympians Association Environment Committee. Through Transition Towns, I set up a local group, Portland for the Planet. We planted trees, pushing for plastic free, all of that. I'm on the Portland Town Council Climate and Ecological Emergency Working Group and the Stop Portland Waste Incinerator campaign group. So I have a lot of experience over the last 2 years of activism and campaigning and protests. But it is the year 2021, and just hearing myself say that sends shivers down my spine. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that our planet is broken. Humanity is waging war on nature, and this is suicidal. The EU deputy said that unless we make significant changes, our kids will be fighting over food and water. Yet carbon dioxide levels are 62% higher now than they were when international negotiations began in 1990, and we're at plus 1.2 degrees of global overheating, which is already causing towns to spontaneously combust. The leaked IPCC report due out next year says that we are on track to reach 1.5 degrees by 2026. And we already know that we're on track for 3 to 5 degrees of global warming. I remind us all about this because it's knowing that is what motivates me. It's knowing that enables me to step out of my comfort zone, to be a rebel, you know, I'm a law-abiding citizen to date, but I'm not actually afraid of getting arrested anymore. Nor sort of the ridicule from people that don't yet fully understand the gravity and the immediacy of the situation that we face. What I fear most is the judgment of my child. You know, when he does eventually ask me, what did you do when there still was time to act? You know, up until this Police Crimes and Courts and Sentencing Bill was proposed, we were exercising our democratic rights. You know, I'm a trained police liaison with Extinction Rebellion, and working with our local police, they were really helpful at helping us to facilitate marches and protests. And they even publicly praised our conduct afterwards. The police have escorted us during marches and actions targeting our county council, our MP, banks. We've raised awareness of air pollution and sea level rise, fast fashion. We have an oil well proposal and a waste incinerator on our doorstep, so plenty to protest locally. Mostly these actions have been really fun and made me feel really uplifted to take part in them. We wheeled a 12-foot high pink dodo through the town, bank to dirty fossil fuel funding bank with the police escort. And none of these actions were against the law. And all of them made people stop and look and question, and they made it into the local media on printed, radio, and some within TV. Other actions that are perhaps a little more spicy haven't been pre-liaised with the police, such as the recent Rebellion of One action, where one person sat in the road with a sandwich board expressing their fear for the climate crisis. Nor did we pre-liaise the recent McSit-in or Paint the Streets, and when bike lanes were spray painted with chalk where they need to be bike lanes, and still 2 years later there are no bike lanes there. Our area has definitely seen its fair share of action. And then I joined Ocean Rebellion, which is a sister movement of Extinction Rebellion, and it differs in that it doesn't advocate for arrest. You know, what it does is design conscious pricking, visually telling, shocking, confronting, creative actions, images, photos that can accompany the stories and help to tell the stories that we need to about the destruction of our oceans. And I found it really a lot easier to sell to more people to get on board with this movement, that there's no risk of arrest. The co-founder, however, was still threatened with arrest before the G7. You know, if the laws do change, some people will continue without even the fear. They will accept that imprisonment may well be a sacrifice that they're making in order to fight this fight. Others, including myself being a mother, are going to need a more moderate flank to engage within. We've been lucky to date that we have been able to protest in the UK, but this government is moving to limit those rights with this new legislation. I believe, as they have singled out Extinction Rebellion and BLM, that it is to a certain extent that it shows a measure of XR's success that they feel that they need to do this, but it also shows that they're simply not willing to do the right thing, because that really is all they need to do to get XR off the street. It's just start doing what's necessary to reduce our emissions. Extinction Rebellion follow a long, noble tradition of non-violent direct action, and these tactics and methods have been used successfully many times in the past at forcing societal change. And the people and the millions that surrounded them are regarded as heroes now, and their movements are regarded as having been on the right side of history. But at the time, they were often vilified as criminals for having broken the law. Lord Hoffman says that civil disobedience on conscientious grounds has a long, noble tradition in this country. People who break the law to affirm their belief in injustice or government action are sometimes vindicated in history, and the suffragettes are an example of this. There is a right or a duty to rebel against a government that is acting against the common interest of its citizens and its people. You know, they're breaking the civil contract between us. And Lord Jonathan Sumption, an ex-Supreme Court Justice, defended those who broke the law on medical grounds, saying that it can be morally acceptable to break a law, and that there is actually a legal defense that says that if you that you haven't broken the law, if there's a reason to do so, and it's called the necessity defense or duress of circumstances. It's really great that the Shell 7 is going to be spoken about tonight, and that the jury found them not guilty. And there were a number of Rebellion of One activists that cases were dismissed by judges, and in fact they were praised and told to carry on. Paul Stevens is a retired detective sergeant and of the Met Police, and he's now a fellow spokesperson of Extinction Rebellion. And he said that that tasking the police with investigating several thousand peaceful protesters who dare to speak truth to power will be laughed at by real police and distract them from the necessary tasks of keeping us all safe. You know, there is a risk that actions can be seen as extreme when they're not properly explained. So it's really important when you're doing an action that you get the messaging right, that it's on the banners and the placards, so the photo that gets put out in the media can't be misconstrued. Yeah, so these accusations of extremism, when people are kind of whipped up into fear and hate of us, which can happen when we're being called dangerous extreme criminals, can actually put environmental protesters' lives at risk, and especially those in other parts of the world. You know, 4 environmental activists are killed each week. Successful civil resistance, you know, really hinges on non-violence. Social science tells us that non-violent resistance has a much higher chance of success than a violent one, and it's morally right. You know, we're not naturally violent by nature. We're just ordinary people who want to live a worthwhile life and leave a habitable planet for future generations. Equally, we shouldn't condone those who do resort to violence because we don't understand the situations that they face. Other key elements are to cause destruction and create dilemma situations to get attention of people in the media and government. You know, actions such as blocking roads, boycotts, strikes, camping out in trees and tunneling under them to protect them, and many creative actions that disrupt business as usual, that pierce consciousness and provoke thought, that get attention of the media and government. Being nonviolent also lowers barriers of entry into a movement. And the social science tells us that a larger, more diverse nonviolent movements are more likely to succeed. The question is, you know, can XR mobilize the masses? Or is there a need for a new and accessible movement that can move into the space that XR has created, a more moderate flank? My feeling is the Green Party should now be the ones that step up and that use their respected voices, step forward and be heard, and to lead the masses to action. I think that the window of opportunity for the Green Party to really make its mark is closing, because the other parties are now picking up and running with the green agenda. You know, this week in the Telegraph, a headline read, "Let's tackle climate change before the left sees it." I say, let's seize it. Let's do what we can to ensure COP isn't a suicide note to Mother Nature and all the life that she supports. Let's protest this bill. Let's fight for our rights. Let's fight for our children's future and all the life on Earth. Let's push for this climate and ecological emergency bill. Let's show up en masse at protests as the Green Party, or as Greens can, with our messaging focused on the solutions that we want and need. Let's support our children in solidarity with their strikes, and call upon all other groups and individuals to unite collectively together. Thank you.
Fantastic. Always a passionate speech from Laura, and always kicking us off, you know, on a good foot. I think, thank you so much for starting us off there. I think, I mean, I always think when you talk, it's great. It's, you know, one of the things that always resonates with me is that that answering to the next generation, and I think that will be a huge question. I think that the generation above ours is already answering, and I think, but they didn't have maybe the access to the information that we have now, and it wasn't, you know, the masses weren't engaged in that sort of you know, ecological disaster that we're facing today. So it was a different story maybe, but we do know, and we do have the information, and we do have the means. So I would rather say that, you know, we took action change something, even if we, even if it's not everything, something's got to change. But yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for starting us off there. Okay, so now we are going to Jules. So Jules is a human rights lawyer and head of actions against police and state team at Baldwin. He's represented several MPs in their challenge to the Metropolitan Police, who were trying to ban Extinction Rebellion, the uprising protests in London in 2019. More than 400 XR activists were arrested during the 4-day ban, which I'm sure he will tell you about. But he believes that, protest is necessary, as do we all, and that public concerns need to be heard in some way, and that non-violent civil disobedience is one of those ways that can happen. So, Jules, your 10 minutes starts now.
Thank you very much. I am going to pose and try and discuss 5 questions. I'm going to try and do it quite quickly because I do firmly believe that conversations are best when everyone participates rather than, as someone said earlier, you get spoken at. So the 5 questions that I want us to look at are, where are we now in terms of where the law is before this bill? What does this bill do? What powers does it introduce? What has been the response to this bill? Is this bill necessary? And if not, why is it here? Those are the points that I'm going to try and whistle through in my 10 allocated minutes. So where are we now? Everyone has the right to peaceful protest. The Human Rights Act incorporates the European Convention on Human Rights, and in particular Article 10, the freedom of expression, and Article 11, the freedom of assembly. These 2 rights taken together are essentially what we rely on in order to protect our right to protest. The right to protest isn't an unlimited right, it's a qualified right, which means that it can be restricted if the restriction is permitted by law and the restriction is necessary and proportionate in a democratic society. The European Convention on Human Rights imposes on the state, on the government, both a positive obligation to facilitate protest, but also a negative obligation not to interfere with the right to protest. It is and it has been for a long time a matter of domestic and international law. And I saw that Laura referred to Lord Hoffman and Sumpton as well. And there are many, many, many legal precedents that make it very clear that peaceful protest should be seen and heard and will often be disruptive. On the 25th of June, we're not speaking about that today, but this today, I don't think, unless it comes up in questions, but a very important case was handed down in the Supreme Court in the DPP v. Ziegler, which was a protest case. The judges in that case referred to an important piece of legislation that basically said that protest may cause some disruption to ordinary life, but that it is important to show a certain degree of tolerance towards peaceful gatherings if the freedom of assembly guaranteed by Article 11 of the Convention is not to be deprived of its substance. We expect protests to be disruptive to some extent. And we will see later in the legislation that causing somebody unease is to be restricted. But anyone who has ever engaged in protest or been involved in protest will know that if you don't cause any unease, you may as well not protest. It could be an entirely different gathering, but unease, making people reflect on what they're doing and perhaps change their habits, is the essence of what protest is about. So what we're looking at briefly here is part 3 of the government's police crime sentencing and courts bill, which is the part of the bill that actually focuses on protest. Unfortunately, on 5th of July, very recently, the bill passed the reading in Commons and has now gone up to the House of Lords, who will no doubt suggest very many amendments to the bill. The House of Commons, there were already many amendments proposed to the bill, but all of them were overruled and taken out. In the House of Lords, no doubt many more amendments will be proposed, and then it will go back down to the House of Lords, who are likely to probably reject most of them. And the bill will probably ping up and down between the House of Commons and House of Lords until the House of Commons, through its huge majority, will probably force the bill through anyway. So I'm not sounding very optimistic, but that is the way these things usually work. It's not good news at the moment. So the key components of the bill are, the first one is a new trigger for conditions to be imposed on protest. And the new trigger is noisiness. Noisy protests are now liable to be restricted under this new legislation. The legislation also expands the types of conditions that can be imposed on assemblies, so that the sorts of conditions that can be imposed on assemblies, i.e. static protests, are now going to be much more like the sorts of restrictions that can be imposed on marches. It also creates new statutory offences. So statutory nuisance, for instance, is put on a proper legal footing rather than common law. It makes it easier to convict protesters for existing offences. So, for instance, convictions for breaching conditions imposed on protests. Previously, it had to be proved in the criminal courts that you were aware of the conditions, but this new legislation proposes that you could be convicted if you ought to have known about the conditions being imposed, which makes conviction a lot more easy. It creates massively disproportionate new penalties. So for instance, if you are convicted of criminal damage to a memorial, the definition of a memorial is incredibly broad to include all sorts of statutes. If you're convicted of that in the Crown Court, you could now be liable to up to 10 years in prison. This new legislation also gives the Home Secretary power to define what constitutes disruption without any other parliamentary sort of scrutiny. And finally, this new legislation redefines what it is to be an assembly. So one person now, the protests, and Laura, you spoke to the recent protests of one person can now be a gathering for the purposes of this legislation, and all these conditions in relation to protests can be imposed on that one person. So what has the response been to this bill? Well, joyously, it sparked protests across the country in Kill the Bill protests. And I would just say that if there is to be any change in the heart of Commons or the House of Lords, I am thoroughly behind all protests against this bill, because if this bill gets through, then the right to protest in future will be seriously restricted. So get out there and protest now while there's still a chance. The Parliamentary Committee, Joint Committee on Human Rights, has published a report just before the last vote, and that said that this bill curbs non-violent protest in a way that's not consistent with our human rights, and the committee has called for the complete removal of some of the clauses in the bill. And it has stated that the new noise trigger for conditions on protest is neither necessary nor proportionate and should be deleted from the bill. The new powers to impose conditions on a one-person protest in England and Wales should be dropped. And on sentencing, the clauses that increase penalties for breaching conditions placed on protests should be removed, as a case has not been made out for them. Harriet Harman, the chair of the committee, I'm going to quote it because it's well worth a listen if you haven't read it yourself, said, "One of the most fundamental rights is the right to protest. It is the essence of our democracy. To do that, we need to make ourselves heard. The government proposals to allow the police to restrict noisy protests are oppressive and wrong. Noisy protests are the exercises of the lungs of a healthy democracy. They should not be treated as an inconvenience by those in power." And I absolutely agree with that. So why is the bill here? Were these powers necessary? I think you can guess what my likely response is, but I will spell it out anyway. No, these powers were not necessary. I don't think I mentioned, did I mention the fact that that protest in this country has already been regulated by statute for 85 years. The first public order bill was introduced in 1936, and the current bill that is in force was introduced in 1986. So we have had a statutory framework for protest in this country for 85 years. So are these new powers necessary? I would say an absolute resounding no. The Metropolitan Police and other police chiefs made it clear that they didn't request the change in relation to noise, as a trigger for imposing conditions. Matt Parr of HM Constabulary, what he said about this bill is, and he was one of the architects of a report that the government relied on in order to work up and introduce this bill. He gave evidence to the Select Committee, and what he said about this bill is that with some very strong caveats, we were broadly of the opinion that all 5 proposals in the legislation would enhance the effectiveness and efficiency of the police. But whether or not they are necessary is really not a matter for us. That is a matter for government. So far you've got the police saying, we're not saying we need these powers, and you've got HM Constabulary saying, well, it will make policing much more efficient, but we can't say if it's necessary. That's a matter for government. As Jenny indicated earlier, I was involved. I represented Baroness Jenny Jones and a number of other Green parliamentarians and activists in the case in the autumn of 2019, where, in fact, I think it was closer to 1,000 protesters who had been arrested for breach of Section 14 of the Public Order Act in the autumn uprising. And in that case, the police had restricted protest in accordance with Section 14 of the Public Order Act, and we went to court to argue that power was not used appropriately, and all the arrests pursuant to that power were therefore unlawful, and the court agreed. But why I mention that right now is because at paragraph 76 of that judgment, and it's well worth having a quick look at, the representative of the police commissioner stated in court that so far as the commissioner of the police was concerned, no additional powers were needed by the police to control future protests that were sufficiently extreme as to test police resources to breaking point. So they were satisfied that the current legislation was sufficient for their purposes of policing the most disruptive protests. Last quick point about is this law necessary is that further evidence to the Select Committee said that from January to April this year, there had been 2,500 protests, and that conditions had only been imposed on about a dozen of them. So you would imagine that if there was a desperate need for new powers and the new powers and that the old powers were insufficient, that these they'd be used all the time to try and stem the tide. Anyway, I'm looking at the clock. I'm going to push on quickly. So why is this law here? One is it costs. The government fact sheet on introducing the bill says that policing protests is a massive drain on public funds, and it refers to the Extinction Rebellion protests in 2019 as costing about £37 million. What I would say is that this legislation not only represents a cut in democracy to achieve a cost savings, but this legislation fails to recognise that there is an unequal access to power. Corporations and wealthy individuals may have direct access to government, but for many of us, protests may be the only way to draw attention to grievances or injustice. I also believe that this bill is an attempt to divert attention away from some truly appalling policing, which I would include the policing of the autumn rebellions. I also would say that this bill is a symptom of a illiberal government. I don't think any of us have been fooled into believing that Mr. Johnson's reluctance to impose COVID restrictions and his excited anticipation of Freedom Day is born out of a love of freedom and aversion to state control. The prorogation of Parliament in 2019 makes it clear that Brexit wasn't about restoring powers to Parliament, but rather than to the executive. And now in front of us, we have the policing bill, we have the Nationality and Borders bill, and we have the voter ID bill. And all of these bills taken together show the direction of travel in terms of this government. I'd also say that this bill is part of the current culture wars. The legislation emphasizes the polarization in society, and it perhaps is intended to appeal to and energize the core supporters of this government. This new legislation increases criminalization of protests and seeks to define the protest that we engage in as other, as something that would interfere with the welfare and livelihood of normal people. What I'd say is that there is blatant hypocrisy in this government. On the one hand, we must learn to live with COVID and the thousands of people who will be put at risk of illness and death so that we can be free of wearing masks and distancing and engage in recreational gatherings. The freedom to gather for the purpose of protest is to be banned if it
Jules,
criminalization of protest will.
Oh, sorry, no, carry on, sorry.
The criminalization of protest will end up meaning it's an activity that only those with nothing to lose can risk engaging in. And as every dictator finally finds out and learns, muting the voices and injustices in society.
Okay, I think the voice came back at the end then. You'd finished speaking in the video, but the voice carried on for me. So I hope everybody got to hear what Jules said at the end. Maybe if you turn your camera off, Jules, it sometimes helps with the sound.
Hello.
Hi. We can hear you again. I don't know if you can hear me, then maybe try and turn your camera off just so that we can hear your sort of final 10 seconds.
You want my final 10 seconds again?
Yeah, if that's all right. Sorry, Nabeela's asking if we can have it again.
I'm very sorry. I was just saying that I was actually just adding my comment on the bill. And I was essentially saying that this bill is blatant hypocrisy. I don't know if you heard that bit. Did you hear that bit?
Yeah, it was basically from hypocrisy, and it was basically the government is, you know, very hypocritic, and then after that it broke down a bit.
Okay, so I was saying the blatant hypocrisy of this government is clear. We must learn to live with COVID, and thousands of people will be put at risk of illness and death so that we can be free of wearing masks and distancing and engaging in recreational gatherings. But the freedom to gather for the purpose of protest is to be banned if it causes no more than unease. This bill represents an existential threat to protest in the UK. The measures are likely to have a disproportionate impact on brown, black, and racialized communities, as police powers always do. The criminalization of protest will end up meaning it's an activity that only those with nothing to lose can risk engaging in. Every dictator eventually finds out that muting the voices of dissent does not make dissent go away. It makes the leaders more deaf and more blind to the wrongs and injustices in society.
Absolutely. I'm so glad we got you to repeat that, because it was a fantastic ending. Really appreciate your thoughts on this subject, Jules. I mean, it was a really interesting sort of technical overview at the beginning there, but I think you're right. This is part of their culture war. This is part of an oppressive regime that seems to be coming out of the Conservative Party. And as you say, you know, we'll have no protests, but I'm sure Cheltenham races will still go ahead, and Boris Johnson and all his friends will be very happy about that. Really appreciate you coming and joining us tonight, and I think there will be a lot of questions for you at the end that I've seen coming up in the chat there. So if you've got time to have a quick look before the end, then that would be great. Laura, I don't know if you wanted to just say anything, or if you're already on another call, that's fine, don't worry. I feel like you're non-stop webinars here, but I know you had one question for you, and I know you have to leave, sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really, really scary to hear, Jules. Thank you for educating me fully on the extent of what we might face going forwards. It really is frightening. I look forward to hearing everybody else speaking when I listen back to the video. Apologies, I have to duck out now. I am in a third meeting for the evening.
Don't worry, thanks for joining us, Laura. We really appreciate it as
you.
always, and we'll see you soon. Okay, so moving on to our next speaker, who is a local person. So David Lambert is an Extinction Rebellion activist. He's from Stroud, who was one of the group charged in the criminal damage after an action at the Shell HQ building. He's going to give us a bit of information about his personal experience there and his thoughts on police bill, the right to protest, and how, you know, the government is failing to protect humanity, and that we absolutely need to do that to save humanity and the natural world. Cool. If you're there, David.
Yep. Hi, thank you, Jenny. Everyone, I guess everyone can hear. I'll try to stick to 10 minutes. I haven't prepared anything, but we've done a lot of talking about the Shell action. So, I will. I'll be very glad to answer questions as well, because I'll do my best to cover things quickly, but I'm sure there'll be things I've left out. It's great to hear Jules. We owe a lot to his colleagues, well, another company, HJA, and other solicitors, who gave us an enormous amount of help, and until we sacked our lawyers on the eve of the trial. But I'll come on to that. So massive respect to people fighting within the system. So just a little bit of background about me. I'm 62. I'm self-employed, and in 2018, I'm a father of 3. In 2018, when I heard Gail Bradbrook's talk, Heading for Extinction, I was in the back room when she was videoing it before she used it, and it went all over YouTube. I was really shocked. And I am the first to confess that up until then, I was not, I mean, I'd been a member of the Green Party on and off. I'd leafleted, I'd helped with election things. I'd signed petitions, I'd written letters, I'd gone on the odd demo, but I kind of thought that, that although I'd known about global warming, nice gentle word, climate change, another nice gentle word, it was kind of being taken care of between the NGOs and all the scientists and government, that we'd be okay. And I got on with my life. So 2018, I heard Gail, and something, I was really shocked. And I also heard Jem Bendell talking about deep adaptation, which I'd be very glad to talk about as well. And between those two, my world was turned upside down. I took a couple of months off just to sort of read the science, and thought, fuck, this really is happening. It's catastrophic. It chimed with everything I knew about about the disappearance of wildlife, which I'd known for a long time because I was a bird spotter and a walker and the rest of it, so a gardener. So my world was turned upside down. And at the beginning of 2019, I thought I'm going to spend at least 2 or 3 days a week with XR. And yes, I'm willing to rebel. Yes, it makes sense. The social contract has been broken. Yes, I'm willing to be arrested. I can do it because my working life is coming towards the end. In my 60, the mortgage was paid off. The kids were grown up. I could do this. And one of the things that I'm really keen to stress is I don't think arrestability is any more key than what gets sometimes called leafleting, because someone who's being arrested is in the center of a very secure cocoon in the middle of an action. But the person who's doing the real work is the one who's walking around the edge of that action, explaining to members of the public, what is going on? Why can't I get to work? Why are you blocking the road? And that is where the work of XR is being done. So I'm really keen to stress that I don't think arrestability is for everyone, and nor is it sort of any more important. There's no core periphery on this. So background done. The action itself took place in April 2019, the April Rebellion. And we went to the Shell building, 7 of us, on the first day of the rebellion, on the Monday, and we we broke windows, and we spray painted and poured fake oil over the front of the building. We were very clear that this was non-violent. People can discuss whether breaking windows is a violent action. Maybe violence is when people are involved rather than property. That's one question, but I think also it was about intention. So what we did was done with a great sense of intention. We weren't wielding, I mean, the word smash is a violent word, but what we did was we broke the windows with glass punches, little things the size of a cigarette lighter. And we weren't daubing graffiti, we were putting up messages. Shell knew, Shell lies, and Shell kills. So we felt that what we were doing was not reckless or random. It was done with great intention, and specifically to get us into the Crown Court to cause enough damage, over £6,000 worth, so that a charge of criminal damage ends up in front of a jury. So that was what we did. We were all arrested at the site. None of us tried to avoid being arrested. We took responsibility for the action. Charged, and then 2 years later, we finally came to court in April this year. It was a long wait. A lot had changed in those 2 years with XR, during 2020, of course, the lockdown, the October Rebellion where we really had to push back from the media and from the politicians who, distinguished between what they called, legitimate protest, either kind of quiet protest that may survive the new bill, and disruption. And they said it's okay to protest, but it's not okay to disrupt. So it's this two-faced, fork-tongued bollocks that we see in the government ministers and Johnson and Patel. Anyway, I mustn't get started on that. So anyway, things had changed, but so we're facing the Crown Court is a jury trial led by a judge, and we put in an outline of our defences. So these are legal defences prepared by HJA, Raj Chadha, who was our solicitor, and in advance, a few months, March time. And the judge writes back with a ruling on the defences. And he basically said, none of these defences is going to be admitted, right? These are not, we're not going to admit Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and certainly not necessity. And necessity is the argument that I was compelled to act to save lives and prevent injury, which is kind of what we were doing. But that law, as we've all heard about Lord Hoffman, has been ruled out by the higher courts in a very simplistic message, which says there is no connection between the damage you're doing, say, at the Shell building, and saving lives elsewhere in the country or the world. There's no connection. It's not the same as breaking a window so that you can get someone out of a burning house. So this is a question of nexus, a connection, and it's another example of the law being so far behind where people already are in terms of understanding that there is a connection between what Shell have been doing for 40 years and the catastrophe that we are now facing. So anyway, so there's no legal defense, we were told. And at that point, the solicitor said, well, you might as well sack us because we won't be allowed to say anything. But if you represent yourselves, the judge has to allow you to explain your motives. So we checked out, we read some really interesting stuff about what the basis of the law is. And behind, with all due respect to Jules, behind all the professionalization of the law and the obfuscation and the mystification of it, there's a really simple process, which is what we tuned into, which is, it's kind of medieval. You can imagine a medieval village. Someone has nicked a loaf of bread And the person's hauled back with a half-eaten loaf, I guess. And a group of villagers sits down and says, you've got to tell us why you did that. What were you doing? Why did you do it? And that person then gets an opportunity to explain. And then those people, those villagers, that group of villagers, then makes a decision on whether someone is guilty or not. And that's what's happening. Once you've taken the lawyers out of the situation, as a defendant, litigant in person, self-repping, you're talking directly, one person to 12, across the room. The judge is peripheral, the CPS barristers are peripheral, and you're explaining who you are, what you did, and why you did it to 12 other ordinary people. And I'm getting goosebumps now. It's a really moving experience because you make a connection. There were 6 of us. One of us had to plead guilty because she couldn't do two weeks of trial because of childcare. But there were 6 of us, one after the other, explaining in completely different ways why we believed that we were right to act, and we had no choice because government's not acting. So it was a revelation to me, because when we decided to go without barristers, you think, shit, I've got to learn all this stuff about law and cases and precedent and all these weird rules about when I can stand up and when I can't stand, But actually, I'm here to tell you folks that it's not as scary as that. I do want to add, though, that it was a kind of an alignment, a coming together of multiple factors, that jury trial we had in April. And I don't think, I'm not suggesting that we've got the codes to unlocking the inherent resistance to justice that there is in the legal system. I'm not saying this is something we can just replicate everywhere, but I do think that opportunity to connect one person to 12 others in a jury trial is massive, and it is a source of great hope. We have got stuff, I've got stuff written down about it, which I can put some links up on the chat. But I'll stop there, I think, Jenny, rather than sort of, talk. So I'm really looking forward to answering some questions. Thanks, guys.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, David. It's so nice to have that personal perspective on protest and what it means to people, and also, the other side of the coin from Jules in terms of breaking down that stereotypical judiciary and and having that raw connection with people. And I'm sure that's one of that will happen time and time again, where juries who are made up of regular people, they can't see you as a guilty person because they know what they see themselves in that and they have those same worries and those same concerns about the government and the environment. So no doubt, really appreciate you sharing, and I'm sure that there will be some questions that come up. So let's go to our final speaker, Nabeela. So Nabeela Akhtar, an anti-racism campaigner involved in inclusion work with a focus on intersectionality, who's been working with organisations such as Stride Against Racism, which formed last year in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, highlighting injustices faced by racialized minorities and trying to promote understanding through learning and partnership and direct action of exactly what those marginalized people are going through, and has taken part in actions on lots of causes like Reclaim the Night, anti-war, Palestinian solidarity, pro-EU, which I think you'll find, Nabeela, most people on this call have been part of as well, and obviously Black Lives Matter. And so, yeah, let's hear her thoughts on the police bill and how protest is being demonized to stop scrutiny. Thanks, Nabeela.
Okay, so much of what the others have said comes into a lot of what I had intended to say, really. So I'm gonna try and touch on things and be a little bit, I guess, just on the spot and glance at my notes. So my situation is that someone is their 30s, a brown woman, Azad Kashmiri descent on my family side, from Birmingham, living in Cheltenham, been involved with anti-racism groups in Cheltenham, been really aware of what difference protests made in where I lived in Birmingham, where I initially grew up, left behind communities that were essentially brown and black at that point. They are still struggling. The issues that those injustices have left behind continue to be compounded. Those people continue to be demonized and trapped. It's quite difficult when this is a bill, and I actually wanted to avoid talking so much about personal experience here, really. But it's been that kind of day and it's been that kind of week. I'm also disabled, a lot of it acquired in the past 4 years. That I was working for the NHS, and I had been working for the NHS for a number of years here and worked in research, NHS social care, charitable organizations for a lot of years. So just in terms of social issues, equity, equality, fairness, valuing the different people in our communities, representing, helping them advocate for themselves, empowering people. Those are issues that are very important to me. I protested in Birmingham going back, you know, and as a brown woman, my encounters with police, with authorities were quite different to the white people there, but also quite different from the black men and the Asian men. And those are things that have gotten worse. But in certain parts of Birmingham, always called a riot. Always called a riot. We ignore what is happening there for decades, the pain inflicted over and over. Some new oppression comes into play. People can't cope with it anymore. It's a tipping point. They act. They protest. They are ignored. They are demonized. They are policed with a particular military-like heaviness. People are hurt. They don't have a great access to, legal help. They are going to get sentenced worse. They have families, they have children. They know their children are going to go through this. Is that getting any better? I really don't think it is, because, I do a little bit with a CPS. We'll see where that goes. But I'm not the most optimistic, and I'm quite focused on receipts. And the reason I said I talk about communication here is because I think so much more we need to be communicating in a multitude of ways, and lots of different causes and organizations. We intersect so much in terms of what Jules talked about in terms of environment. These are also connected. We know that the people with the least are going to be affected worst. I can talk about race and marginalized people from that respect. A lot of people simply are not interested. I will hear PC gone mad, victim card, but I think it's very important that we are centering on those experiences too and changing that, but also looking at the connections with other experiences, because we're seeing all sorts of people demonized here, aren't we? GRT have been demonized a long time, with BLM, Black people, brown people. Women, when they ask for something that is reasonable and that nobody wants to allow it to happen, we're demonized as women, white women too, but not always to the same degree as when it's an intersect of race and, and the LGBTQI, being disabled. White working class people are too. And we see people stripped of working rights, the terms and conditions, going into unemployment, all sorts of things. And they aren't protesting. They used to protest, didn't they? And what's that about? are we getting through to them too? I don't feel like it's my job or it's fair to me to have to go and, you know, deliver this message there. But the government certainly are in demonizing all of these causes, all of these organizations, all sorts of protests. There were some preschool meals protests. A lot of it was happening online. There were small things. There were things like plates being left outside places and gatherings. There were Remain ones. Now, I know very much that Alex Chalk did not like this. And I know very much that where his office is now is less accessible. And with the Kill the Bill ones, the police were waiting outside. I know very well that he accused me of being aggressive in a Zoom when I was talking to him about a meeting I tried for ages to arrange about the COVID regulations that were coming in. I think it was in September before they came in. I know very well he was not at all familiar with them. And he did yabber on about civil discourse. And I did, and I asked him, why do you support them? I've been writing to you about a number of issues and I'm getting these replies that don't address, and you're not doing anything. I've seen nothing from you in relation to BLM, and part of why BLM was a tipping point here is because the same thing is happening here as in America, you know, and that there is real marginalization and deprivation all through Gloucestershire, you know. Not interested. Passes the buck. He seems to have an increasing number of aides to pass the buck to, who also gaslight in all kinds of forms. He did report my Zoom, but no GDPR. Still hasn't provided that, by the way. I did ask for a copy, passing the buck on that one too. So I see you, Alex. I might as well mention that while I'm here. It's not gone unnoticed. And I'm happy to talk about it to lots of people. But you see, that avenue has been blocked in terms of getting change happening. Protest is being blocked. That avenue of going to MPs, whether it's your party, whether it's someone who widely agrees with you, whatever, has always been a very limited one. And something that benefits those with the greatest privilege. And even then, very much about power and control and resources. So protest is only more important, yet we're trying to demonize it. And we have to stop that. It's authoritarian. We saw mums in Seattle on the BLM ones being tear gassed. We've seen young people being beaten. We've seen actually, I know in Gloucestershire, some protests weren't allowed to happen. Of course, in Lydney, repeatedly. I wonder why. I know that Facebook, Cheltenham Spaces, they don't let you talk about BLM. They don't let you talk about social issues. They don't let you talk about Extinction Rebellion. They don't let you talk about protest. You go anywhere near any of these issues. Free school meals, they were really not comfortable with either. Funny that, but some people on Free School Me started engaging. Alex Chalk very quickly and swiftly turned off all his Facebook comments completely forever after his aides couldn't catch up on deleting them quickly enough. And, you know, I was there, I was taking my screenshots. It was fun. But on the Free School Meals, we got attention. Lots of different people, different little groups. We were communicating, many I've never met before. Using Twitter, doing memes, all sorts of different groups. Many who are not remotely involved in protest historically. We're just using all the tools we have at our disposal, do whatever we can. I went to the BLM one in Cheltenham, though I was high risk with COVID and so on, because partly I felt like I couldn't not, because I saw the abuse being sent out there about these people and this mission to police those people. And this government is literally telling those people that racism is okay. And this week preaching about how, oh God, it's terrible the abuse Marcus Rashford, Zaka and Sancho received and Sterling has been receiving. You know, there's hypocrisy on race. But it's not just on that, is it? It's on all of these issues, these different ways they divide and conquer us. And we need to make sure that our messaging is getting to the people that this is not just about this. This is affecting you, how it's affecting you. And yes, lots of people are afraid of being arrested. Well, I've already lost a lot, you know. I don't have any great security here in my life, but you know, it's important. and we need to find ways to support each other as a community so that people feel as safe as they can and respect that that is a genuine fear and there's so many repercussions, and that if we've been through this system and this system has been sympathetic for us, that doesn't mean it's going to be sympathetic to the other person. We know that sentencing is worse for Black and brown people. We know relating to Black and brown lived experience is worse. We know this bill targets certain people. Kill the bill is so important. I've been involved. It's been a real mess. There hasn't been a huge turnout in Cheltenham. I've been really pleased to see all the big protests and just that people are showing solidarity. There is that danger for Black and brown people on any protest. You are more likely to be physically hurt. You are more likely to be further marginalized, and you're already more likely, I mean, with the pandemic, Black men 40 times is it more likely at the moment to have lost their jobs, and quite a few others seem to have leveled out ultimately, and those are often low paying jobs, so progression is terrible too, you know. So there's so much to think about here. People have families, people have livelihoods to worry about, and people are scared, but navigating that fear and doing it anyway is a thing. And I think different organizations, different individuals kind of trying to support each other. I've seen so many lawyers talking about these issues. I mean, we saw legal observers being treated appallingly too, didn't we? So there's been rulings about a lot of these behaviors being unlawful, a lot of the action taken. But with this attack and protest, it's authoritarian. There is no question. It is quite deliberate amongst many things. I agree with Jules, to do this to people, to deprive them of liberty in many ways, to deprive them of a say, to marginalize, and they don't like when they share. The MPs don't even like when you share their voting, you know. There's this coordinated mission of sending all their comms out. The lovely Natalie Elphick, husband of convicted rapist, she stood by, and then on the day after he was convicted. Oh, it's terrible. And back to ending up on some court, one bit of the country or other, a week later, talking about how terrible the asylum seekers are and these migrants, let them drown. These all are things that need challenging. Education. How many children, families, students, adults have been screwed during this pandemic when people were most in need of support? The NHS continuing to be privatized at great speed. Dido Harding and the next person, you know? We just have, and now it is the guy who was he a Facebook guy, I think, who's up for it now? Well, I've worked in the NHS and it's been very clear for a while this was happening, that we were forcing a business model to try and privatize as much as possible, and that things like emergency care will never be profitable, but we will very quickly be in a US style system, and that treatment staff receive is terrible from their, you know, the managers, them trying to raise concerns about PPE. They were fine protesting under those crappy COVID regulations. By the way, Alex's reason for supporting that bill, he clearly had not read. Well, COVID moves fast. I've never been able to get more than that out of him. And he promised we were going to arrange a follow-up. But after the civil discourse, I said, what about Julian Lewis and all those MPs who had the MIP removed? And he was, oh God, I've got another appointment. I've got to go now. So, you know, if those methods worked, if just petitions worked, would we be doing these things? So this is so important to challenge. We don't know how much Lords are going to be able to delay, how much they're going to get done here, and when they're going to call an election again, and things like progressive alliances and parties, I think is really important as well, to be tackling this, working, you know, recognizing we're distinct, we have different particular focuses, but we have so much shared here, and that these are all issues affecting us all, and we need to think bigger picture as well as the local, and take multi-pronged approaches. And so even sort of on Twitter, if you're not comfortable protesting, you can go and talk to people about who are demonizing it and challenging it. You can on your Facebook bring these issues in there, encourage education and understanding. talking about examples they can relate to. And there's always an example we can all relate to in relation to protests. It doesn't matter who we are. There's something that we can relate to. But I don't think that it's one or the other is the right way. We use all the tools because we have to, we know that.
Absolutely. Oh my God, thank you so much, Nabeela, for talking to us. It was really inspiring to hear you talk and all those different, you know, hats you've worn and experiences that you've had, whether in Gloucestershire or in Birmingham. And I mean, we have a similar issue here in Stroud with our MP and the responses that we get. Just before this session, I was actually sent a response by someone who had to give apologies for being here. And the way that they manipulate the truth in order to give an answer to a question that you didn't ask is really unbelievable. You know, I might ask that person if we can share the response more widely with the people who've attended this session today, because it really is shocking to read.
I've seen quotes from Alex's aides after he got more boyfriend. They think I've forgotten.
They always do, but we never forget. That's the thing, isn't it? So yes, absolutely, you know, checking your privilege, using your privilege for good. I think that all of these things have been themes throughout all of our speakers, making sure that we recognize as white people that we are way less likely to be assaulted at protests, or we are less likely to have harsher punishments or harsher sentences, and that we have to shout the loudest in order to you know, help be allies, be good allies, and help make these changes and things like that is so important. But you know, using tools to organize everything that we have in front of us is also vital. So let's talk to some of the people who have been listening all this time. Hopefully we've got some good questions in the chat. I'm sure that we have, we usually do. I'm going to run from the top, so I'll shout your name out. If you'd like to read your question out, then please do. If you've got, if you don't want to read the question out, then just let me know in the chat and I'm happy to read it out for you. So Paul That Bohemian, I think you had a question right at the beginning about the Tory manifesto. If you'd want to unmute yourself and turn your camera on and ask your question. Okay. Maybe Paul's not with us anymore. Okay, I'll ask the question. I think it's probably to Jules anyway. It's just about, was this police bill in the Tory manifesto? And does that make a difference in terms of how the Lords can hold it up?
I'm very sorry. I can't profess to being that familiar with the Tory manifesto.
That's probably a good thing, isn't it, actually?
I don't know is a simple answer, sorry. Somebody else may have more of a clue, but I think whatever the issue, at the last reading, it passed by about 100-vote majority. And so with the majority that the Conservatives have presently in the House of Commons, I think it would be an incredible uphill struggle for the House of Lords to make any serious dent to that bill.
Okay, thanks, Jules. If anyone else has got a response on the Tory manifesto, I realise now asking the question, it's probably not the right audience to know, but if not, I'll move on to the next question, which is
It wasn't the most detailed manifesto, and it wasn't the greatest manifesto. And we remember it was very quickly whipped together. So there wasn't any kind of real, specificity to this kind of degree, or that would have been, already out there. Yeah.
I guess keeping it vague makes them much less accountable and able to scrutinise it at a later date, so probably not. Okay, Mike, if you're there, if you'd like to come off mute and camera on, you had a question.
Yeah, hi there. It's great so far. Question for Jules. you mentioned right at the beginning, and I had this thought anyways, that you're talking about Articles 10 and 11 of the Human Rights Act. And in my view, this, and from your explanation, it seems to contradict or go against the Act and the Treaty on Human Rights. And now human rights is enshrined in UK law. Wouldn't the Human Rights Act take precedence? So could the new measures in this bill be kind of argued away because the Human Rights Act, it goes against the Human Rights Act? That's just it probably have to be tested in court, but that's just my thought.
I think that, hi Mike, I think that's exactly what's going to happen. There is, unlike in the US, there is no chance of the legislature striking down an act of parliament, and many would argue that there shouldn't be, because obviously it's an elected parliament. The issue then is whether or not the law is compatible with the European Convention of Human Rights. And what will happen, I imagine, relatively quickly is that when these sanctions are imposed on individuals, that cases will be brought to court, and they will then have to be a declaration as to whether or not they're compatible with human rights, and it could well ending up in the European Court that will determine that they probably aren't. But I'm not sure to what extent this government will really care that much about that.
Okay, would it matter the fact that we've got the Human Rights Act anyway? So would they have to read would they have to read this law in conjunction with the Human Rights Act and say if it's not compatible? But, you know, we'll be having activist judges then, so.
Well, I mean, that's exactly right. And the Joint Committee on Human Rights has said in terms that this legislation, or this proposed legislation at the moment, runs contrary to international standards of human rights, and is an unlawful fettering on protest in this country. So yes, these powers are inconsistent with human rights, which is why the courts will potentially, well, should rule that the imposition of these powers are unlawful. The government would be likely to appeal, and they can imagine it sort of being appealed to the highest courts, and then the government would need to reflect on its legislation and determine whether or not to make any amendment, but clearly it's not something that they are likely to be willing to do.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Jules.
Guys. Okay, so the next question came from Martin Large.
Hi, thanks, Jules, for a brilliant exposition. You mentioned that the police bill was a symptom of an illiberal government. I just wondered what other regimes this police bill, if passed, would put us in the same club as? Who would we be keeping company with?
Yes, not a very attractive club. I think we can imagine a number of authoritarian regimes in whose company we might find ourselves in a club with. What I find very depressing about this sort of bill is the impact and the signalling and the encouragement it gives to despots and authoritarian regimes the world over. Because our moral authority as a nation, in 2015, I was at a conference in Kenya where a number of lawyers lawyers and activists from countries all around the world gathered together to discuss the right to protest across the world. And one of the things that I discovered was that obviously Britain is looked upon as this fantastic old democracy and that people do take a lead from it. And what some delegates from Uganda told me is that police officers from this country or representatives of the police had visited them and had told them that the better way to curtail and limit protest was not to go in there and use force, but rather to push through a public order act that would provide a legal framework which could be used to inhibit protest and free speech. And it seems, unfortunately, that what we do in this country is very much latched onto by countries where they, much more authoritarian regimes. And so, we lose our moral authority. We're not able to stand up to the actions and conduct of dictators and authoritarian regimes around the world when they can look at us and go, well, you don't even permit free speech in this country. You ban protest if it's too noisy. It is a club that we are joining through this bill, and it's not a club that any of us who value democracy should ever want to be part of.
Absolutely. Okay, thanks. I don't see any more questions in the chat. I see lots of chat going on, which is great. So I'm gonna, go very authoritarian and use my power as chair to ask a question myself to all of our speakers. Just to say, how do you think this is affecting young people? And if you had to give them one word of encouragement or tell them one word of advice, like what would it be? What would it be to young people who are maybe just starting out understanding what protest means and what it is, and then at the exact same time having it challenged and oppressed? So let's go Nabeela, then David, then Jules. If you've got something to say, if you don't want to answer, then pass it on.
I would say there isn't going to be an ideal time here. And the worst of times are often the most important times to act and do and hit those streets and form a community as part of that. Educate your families as much as you can, your neighbors, get the conversations happening, be talking to your friends. You don't have to hammer it with them with it, but just, this is your future. And so much of it, you already have so much, in many ways, less than what was available to the previous generation. And it's great if you can convince the previous generation to help you here, but I wouldn't bet on that. And this is your investment in your future, in your children's future, in other people's future. Maybe you won't have children. Maybe you'll think this is not a world to bring children into. I don't know. But, is that what you want? Use your power. Use your voice.
Thanks, Nabeela. David?
It's a really good question. I've got 3 kids. First of all, kids 30, 28, 25. I think we really have to acknowledge that we, in this group here, are all in a place where we can protest for all sorts of reasons of class, gender, ethnicity, personal circumstances. And part of me thinks, well, just respect the fact that a lot of young people are dealing with so much other shit. And, we live in a toxic culture, which is shortening lives and causing terrible mental and physical health problems. And young people are suffering that directly and processing it in terms of, culture and politics. So I don't feel I'm in any position to tell people to get out there, to wake up, that kind of stuff, which I think just doesn't help, but to keep talking, to keep on telling, your truth, but most of all to think, okay, it's a tricky one. I wonder what activism in the kind of things we've been talking about, what it's for. I think we're past a lot of tipping points, and I think maybe what we should be thinking about is a kinder attitude to each other. Even the bloke in the 4x4 who I'm leafleting because we've stopped the traffic, and he leans out and lets a volley of abuse. He too is a victim, right? He too is part of this culture. He's suffering, and I think maybe we should be thinking about preparing for what's going to happen, not thinking we can stop it. That's kind of a myth of modernity, that we will fix this. And I wonder if we won't, in which case we need to be a lot kinder to each other, and especially to the younger generation. Support them, respect them, but don't try to tell them what to do.
Thanks, David. Great response. Jules?
Hello. As you may suspect, I'm thoroughly supportive of protests, but one of the things I feel very strongly about is that there must be an honest conversation about the cost, and this bill makes the cost even higher. It makes it particularly high for people from Black, brown or racialized communities. And you only need to briefly look at how BLM protests are policed compared to other protests to be aware of that fact. But this bill does make protest, it does criminalize protest to a far greater extent. It is already highly criminalized, but it does make it significantly more. And David, when he began his talk, noted about his position in life, and his age and what he was doing in his life, and the fact that he had and felt he had much more freedom to be able to risk the consequences of protest at this time. And I am absolutely delighted, and I think what happened in David's criminal case is fantastic. It wasn't expected, but I have so much respect for the fight that you put in there and the results that you got, especially without lawyers. And I'm fully aware, and I do appreciate much of your comments on the complications that lawyers and lawyering brings to the whole process. But what I would just briefly observe, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to put people off protest. I'm thoroughly in favor of it and I engage in it myself, but it is worth just bearing in mind that 95% of all criminal cases are dealt with in the magistrate's court. 85% of all cases heard in the magistrate's court result in conviction. And in the Crown Court, there is a lower rate, but it's not much lower. It's 80% of all cases heard in the Crown Court result in conviction. So there needs to be a certain realism. Protest, but understand the risks and make sure that you're able to take on those risks. And I know that, having represented many professionals who find considerable difficulty. There's a nurse who I represented the other day who was protesting, and one of the first things the police did when she was issued with a fine was say that they were going to contact her professional body to advise them that she had been arrested for protesting and may suffer a criminal conviction as a result. So be strong, but be wise.
And I think now, along those lines that you're just saying, I mean, my work, we're talking about biometric surveillance, which is, I know Jenny Jones, who you previously mentioned as well, a Green Party in the House of Lords, and that is going to make it even more dangerous for people to protest, because they'll be able to be identified, and that identification, like you say, putting their job at risk or putting their family at risk and things like that. So even more complex issues coming into protest and the right to protest in the very near future. Okay, we did have one more question from Paul. Sorry that I missed it. So let's make this the last question and then we will end for the night. So Paul, would you like to read out your question? If not, I'm more than happy to do it for you, but just let me know. Okay, so what are likely to be the unintended consequences of the new law? I think from what Jules was saying earlier around noisy protests and things like that, so chanting at football matches, changing of guards at Buckingham Palace, outdoor concerts, church singings are some of the things that Paul has outlined. So what do we think are the unintended consequences of the new law? Let's start with Jules first.
I'm not sure about the unintended consequences of the new law, because it seems that the government's fully supportive of gatherings for the purposes of drinking in pubs or having dinner or going to concerts or theatres, those sorts of gatherings and commercial gatherings, and I certainly don't begrudge anyone trying to earn a living in the hospitality sector, but almost any kind of gathering is fully endorsed and supported. And the government has just declared that it's not worried about face masks, it's not worried about social distancing. Go and gather for commercial purposes. The real issue for the government is when you gather, even as one person now, a one-person assembly, if you gather as a one-person assembly for the purposes of protest, then that is not permitted, particularly if it causes any other person some unease. So I'm not aware of really any unintended consequences. What I can see are a lot of intended consequences that are seriously going to damage voices of dissent and essentially prevent the government hearing the problems that are going on in society.
May I for a second?
Oh, hi Paul, yeah.
Jules, but it is not the government who decides whether this law is going to be applied in any particular cases. It's usually the police initially, and then obviously the court. And the police are quite keen to apply the law, apply various law at situations which were not intended for that law.
Quite quiet there, Paul, but I think what you were saying is that this is going to be a local authority or local government and local police issue, as well as it being a national bill and a national policy, and that it's about the implementation of that at a local level. Nabeela or David, I don't know if you want to come back to Paul on that with your thoughts.
Yeah, it's quite difficult to talk. I couldn't quite make out what you were saying, Paul. Of course, it's going to be it's going to be applied by chief constables and by local authorities. I can see that is crazy. So what you're going to get is confusion, and I just wonder whether it's impossible to talk about, to guess unintended consequences by definition, but you do think there's a case to be made that badly written laws actually serve the same purpose as the kind of post-fact social media stuff that we've seen rise hugely, which is that it creates uncertainty. And on the one hand, uncertainty is it's just a truth about life, but when it's managed uncertainty, it's incredibly stress and deliberate uncertainty. It's incredibly divisive and damaging to individuals. And I think that is what is being unleashed with this kind of legislation.
Absolutely, chaos theory. Nobody knows where they stand or what it means for them. Nabeela, did you have a final word?
I think Jules kind of said my feelings on it too, really. I think and David, what he said, it's not unintended. There's nothing unintended about this. It's just that we're not necessarily aware of all the consequences because we haven't experienced them yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully, something will happen magical that means that we don't have to go down this road as it is currently intended by the government, which is, squashing our rights, making sure that the right to protest and the right to a public voice is diminished over and over again. And hopefully like I say, that won't happen. Let's remain hopeful, but I think at the same time, I mean, I think Chris Jockle has put it very beautifully there, that he's filled with gloom and fire from this evening's session. And I think that, you know, all of this talk put the fire in our bellies and get out to protest while we still can. So just to say thank you so much to our 4 speakers, to Jules, to David, to Nabeela, and to Laura, who had to leave early. We really appreciate you taking the time to come and speak to us and to have these discussions. It's so important for us to use the tools that we have online to share knowledge and understanding on these really important issues. Please share the recording with your friends and family if they couldn't make it tonight, and we would really invite everybody to put their cameras on for the final 2 minutes, so our speakers know all the lovely faces that have been listening to them. We're having a summer break just now, but we really hope to see you back in September for another fantastic session.